Okay, well, folks, welcome to another Wildlife for You online wildlife class. We're going to be doing a class that I did a number of years ago. I think it's been over 3 years since I did this last one, and it's titled Bears in Your Backyard, and it's all about learning how to peacefully coexist with black bears. Now, when I originally did this class, I did it specifically for a town that was having issues with bears in town and people learning to live with bears. And it is a small town of Durango, Colorado. And so I will have a couple references there in case you see why are you picking on Durango? I'm not picking on Durango, but I'm showing a classic example of what a small rural town that's in beautiful, wonderful black bear habitat has to do in order to live with black bears. And so I will be presenting this. Again, my name is Daryl Radijek. Most of you know me. And so obviously I won't go into too much detail. I've worked with bears for a long, long time, over 25 years, started my career with the Appalachian Bear Center back in 1997, worked there for about 5 years. Then I took some positions with the government, working for the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency for a number of years. I was actually managing the bears within the whole state of Tennessee. I jumped ship from state government to federal government for the last 7 years. I've worked a little bit with the U.S. Forest Service, and now I'm with the Bureau of Land Management, working with all big game animals in the West. So anyway, I've got plenty of experience working not just with black bears, with all sorts of animals. And so what I try to do with all of these presentations is we make sure that they are science-based. This isn't just what my opinion is. We're presenting information that is based on a lot of science, because that's the only way we learn and progress as a society. So anyway, I'm going to jump into the presentation today. And usually what I love doing with a lot of these presentations is starting off with a question. For example, why are we doing this? Are bears in your backyard? Are they really a problem? Now, I'm going to surprise you, because I'm going to say no in some instances. If you want to live out in nature, out in your slice of heaven, back 40 country living, and you have a house like this in the middle of prime wildlife habitat, there's nothing wrong with having bears or other wildlife in your backyard. That's why you moved out there. One of the problems that comes with that responsibility of living there is if those animals then learn to come to your house in order to get food or other resources, that then can become a problem. But just because you see a bear in your backyard doesn't necessarily mean there's a problem. However, in some situations, there, like for example, with this picture you see here, you see where a human has decided to live in bear country. But Kim Delosier, who was the head biologist for Great Smoky Mountain National Park, I love the term he used. He's like, Daryl, there is absolutely bear country out there, but there's also human country. And when you have a situation like this, where it is obviously where the majority of humans live, you see subdivisions popping up. And obviously this subdivision is in a more rural setting because you see lots of trees and forested areas in the background, but this specific area is pretty much what we would call human country at this point. And so the problem with this is when you do have a lot of humans residing in one area, whenever you do get bears coming into those human developed areas, that is when we potentially have issues or conflict with bears and humans. And I think most of you will agree that situations like this, where there's literally a bear in your backyard, especially if it's a subdivision where there's lots of families, lots of human activity going on, this could potentially be a problem. And so this is what we kind of want to address. How do we prevent this from becoming something that's going to appear on the news? Because whenever bears and people mix, you all know I like people, but I love bears. And whenever bears and people mix, it's usually the bear that ends up losing. And so we want to address this particular situation. And to give you an idea of why we need to do this, and this is where I'm not going to pick on the city of Durango, Colorado, but I'm going to give you an example of a typical all-American rural town in the middle of bear country. And so here's an example of what Durango, Colorado looked like up until 1970. And if you can see that map, you can see that that pink area, like right in the center here, the pink area depicts where the subdivisions were in Durango, Colorado in 1970. So you see some subdivisions here, a couple of subdivisions popping up in the eastern portion of Durango. And then lo and behold, let's fast forward about 40 years and look at the subdivisions now. It's literally dotting the landscape. And keep in mind, this whole area, this is southern Colorado, western Rockies in the state of Colorado. So it's beautiful, unbelievable, gorgeous, prime bear habitat, great wildlife habitat for lots and lots of critters out there. And you can see with the development of Durango, Colorado, there's subdivisions everywhere. So they've gone into areas and are literally occupying places that bears and other wildlife used to occupy. And so there's going to have to be some give and take here as far as learning to coexist with these animals. And so to give you an idea of the issues that can come about whenever people are living in this wonderful prime bear habitat. Here's a magnified, you again might not be able to see this too clear if you're using a smaller screen, but here's kind of like an aerial photo of the city of Durango. And so I'm going to zoom in on one little area. And if you can see all these yellow and orange dots, this is where there have been reported bear incidences. And so whether or not it is a sighting or there is actual, and I hate the term conflict, but someone called because they're having a problem with a bear in their yard or a bear on their property. And so if we zoom in here, and there's the magnified, you see those green, not yellow areas, but those green areas is just where people saw a bear in the neighborhood. And so that's an okay sighting because the bear wasn't doing anything. But all those orange dots that you see there that's where bears were causing conflict. They're getting into trash cans or they're breaking into a house or different incidences where they were called because the homeowner was having a problem dealing with this bear on their property. And so look how dense that is. And that's just a small magnified portion of Durango. You can see it's occurring all over the city. And so it just demonstrates that there's this tremendous need for black bear education, how people can learn to better coexist in harmony with these bears. And so that's kind of what I want to do with this presentation is teach people how to live in harmony in bear country. And it seems like it'd be fairly easy because we live in the age of the internet. So all you got to do is get on Google and say, give me bear education. And you're going to have all these different websites thrown at you. And there's some really, really good websites out there, whether or not it's the Bear Smart or Bear Wise or Be Bear Aware, great, great information. But I will tell you, sometimes it's information overload because each and every one of these websites has some really good information about do's and don'ts. But you will be overwhelmed or swamped with trying to absorb or kind of compile all the things that you're supposed to do. It can get confusing because I hate to say it, sometimes there's even conflicting rules and regulations when it comes to bears. And so what I did a couple of years ago, and I hate that I don't really profess this much anymore just because I haven't done these classes, is I devised a way to make it real easy for people to remember what they need to do whenever they're in bear country. And it boils down to a simple thing. All people really have to do is just ask. And so what I mean by that, I I work for the federal government, which does acronyms all over the place. I can't even understand what my colleagues are saying half the time because they use so many acronyms. But this acronym really works well for this purpose. And so when I say just ask, there's three things you gotta be mindful of. You got to be mindful or be able to identify the attractants that are bringing the bear into the area. You also have to know what to do in order to stay safe around the bear. And the K, you've got to be knowledgeable about the bear. The thing I love with this acronym, though, is it's succinct. People can easily remember this. But the best part about it, it applies to all situations. And so it's not just for bears. It's for any animal, any backyard animal that you might want to be mindful of, whether or not it's coyotes or bobcats or bees or skunks, anything that you are potentially worried about as far as coexisting with. If you apply this principle, this ask principle, where you identify the attractants, you got to know how to stay safe around that animal, and you have to be knowledgeable about that specific animal. This acronym works wonderfully well. So it applies to all those potential backyard animals. And so since today we're talking about bears, the first part of this acronym is be knowledgeable. And so the one thing I always stress is, and you know my catchphrase, it's when it comes to wildlife, your knowledge often means their existence. And I cannot stress that even. The more you know and understand these animals, the better off not only you are, but the better off those animals are. And so when it comes to black bears, I always go into this big thing about black bear biology and behavior, but I know who my audience is. And my audience right now are my regulars who have learned this over and over. So I am not going to do the biology and behavior of black bears. You have seen this ad nauseum, and you know what bears are all about. You know how big they are, what they eat, what drives the bears, and most importantly, you know about their characteristics, like their nose that they follow all the time. And so we're going to skip the whole be knowledgeable about black bear talk, because you've probably seen it at least 24 times if you've ever listened to my webinars. So y'all got that when it comes to be knowledgeable about black bears. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go back to another part of that acronym, and we are going to spend some time talking about the attractants and how we need to learn to identify those attractants. And so the easiest thing to do is, all you have to do is think about the things that may attract a bear to your home. And again, remember, if we're talking about any other animal, whether or not it's raccoons or bees or skunks, you just think about that animal and what that animal would be attracted to. In this particular case, like I said, we're going to be talking about bears, and what is going to be the main draw for bears to come into those human areas. And there's one thing that stands out, and everyone can recognize it. We all understand that this can be a really big issue. It's the fact that garbage or trash is a huge attractant for bears. Because think about it, when you put your trash to the street, or the garbage to the street to be picked up, you have all those unwanted food materials that you think were pretty gross because you didn't want to finish the bones or whatever in your steak, or the fatty parts of your steak, and the remnants of the fruits and vegetables that you cut up that you didn't want, and you put all that in your trash. And that trash to you is a buffet of just amazing nutrients to a bear, and it's highly attractive to that bear, and it's throwing out all sorts of aromas and scents that the bears can obviously detect. And so I hate showing these pictures. I could go on a soapbox all the time about how people oftentimes post pictures of bears going through garbage. And I tell you what, these photos, I hate these photos. And I I guess I'm getting crotchety in my old age because I'm always commenting how it'd be so much better if we would post photos of wild bears instead of bears that are lurking or getting into garbage or getting into dumpsters, because I personally don't see something that's so beautiful in that photo. So anyway, that's me getting crotchety. But we all understand that bears love trash. They love garbage. This is one of the main attractants of living in bear country. If the bear has access to your garbage, he or she is going to keep coming back and back. So remember this photo here, all of those yellow or green dots, that is where people were reporting bears getting into their trash cans, or bears getting into their dumpster, or bears getting into their shed. And so the thing is, if it was all about the trash, and don't get me wrong, a big part of it is all about the trash. If it is only the trash, then that would be the only thing we need to focus on. But it's not the only thing we need to focus on, because there's other things that are not so obvious when it comes to accidentally or intentionally luring bears into these human developed areas. And so let's take a look at some of those not so obvious factors that could be a big attractant to a bear. And so this particular picture here looks like a standard second home or first home for someone out in the country, nice place to relax. You don't see too much trash lying around, but guess what? You do see something that could be a potential draw. Now, obviously this food bowl is flipped upside down, but if that bowl is being used to feed a pet, whether or not it's a cat or a dog, obviously a bear is going to enjoy that meal, that easy to come by meal. And so it's going to be drawn to this back porch. And so unfortunately, there's a lot of folks that, now I don't want to say it's just the folks that live out in the country. Look at where I live. Most of you have seen pictures of the house. I'm in a subdivision, but it backs up to a wild area. And we have mountain lions and mule deer and elk and bears in those mountains. And so if I were to feed my dogs in my backyard like this, it would be an easy draw for a bear. And so you got to be mindful of feeding your pets if you live in bear country. You don't want to feed them outside. And so it's not just dog food. It's not just livestock food. Obviously, some people will feed their cats. I will tell you, this plastic box contraption is not bear proof. So a bear can get into that, no problem. Trying to bear proof some of these things is oftentimes futile because they're extremely intelligent. And I laugh because I've been seeing more and more people post the same thing about how the intelligence of the smartest bears is about the same level as some of the dumbest people. And I don't want to say that's true or not, but it makes me laugh, put it that way. So anyway, yes, you've got to be mindful of feeding your pets, whether or not it's cats or dogs. If your animals could get into it, a bear can get into it, and it's a huge draw for that bear to your house. Well, what else? We harp on this all the time. I think this is probably the second most important things, is being mindful of your bird feeders. Now, I am always a proponent. I shouldn't say a proponent. I'm an opponent for feeding wildlife because they don't really need it. But when it comes to bird feeders, I understand it is a useful tool to engage the public into protecting and being in awe and wonderment of wildlife. So lots and lots of people enjoy feeding the birds. Now, obviously, the winter time is usually one of the better times to feed the birds because it's often very difficult for them to find food in the wintertime, and it provides them with maybe some extra energy that they might need. The good thing with providing that food to the birds in the wintertime is bears, for the most part, are hibernating at that time, and you usually don't have too much issue with the bears getting into your bird feeders. if you're feeding at that time. But lots and lots of people like feeding year round. Spring, summer, fall, doesn't matter. And they keep their bird feeders out. Well, guess what happens when you have a bird feeder out and the bears are out? The bears see it as a free meal. This is literally a buffet, and it is going to attract them. Because remember, if you recall, all my classes about bear biology, their stomach drives them. When they can smell some high calorie free foods, they're going to go for it. And bird feeders are exactly that. They're this high calorie, potent, usually there's a large volume of food there because people like putting out lots of seed with their bird feeders, and the bears will just come up and consume everything in that feeder. The thing that I don't like, which is happening more and more, obviously, is you're getting these female bears that are now teaching their cubs that bird feeders are a great source of food. We would rather have that mother bear teach the cubs to find natural foods, whether or not it's berries or earthworms or whatever Mother Nature produces. It's much better for that bear to feed on natural foods than for that mother bear to teach her cubs to feed on unnatural foods. I've mentioned this many times in the past, but if you haven't heard it, bears that become used to feeding in developed areas and become food conditioned, their lifespan is usually almost cut in half. And that's based on research studies of collared bears. So there's so many more dangers that are introduced into that bear's life. And it just hurts me to see photos of these female bears teaching their cubs how to feed on these human provided foods, because she's literally shortening the lives of those cubs by doing that. So it's up to us. That bear is not doing anything wrong. That bear is doing what a bear does. The thing that's going wrong there is having that bird feeder out there that allows bears access to it at all times throughout the year. And like I said before, if it's a bird feeder, lots of people try to bear-proof it. Bears are extremely smart and intelligent, and they will find a way. And so there's rarely any bird feeder out there that is bear-proof, because, like I said, bears are among the smartest animals out there. Now, keep in mind, it's not just the seed kind. Bears love to get their Gatorade too. And those little hummingbird feeders filled with sugar water, that's the energy drink that they absolutely love. And so you have to be mindful of both kinds of feed, the bird feed, whether or not it's the hummingbird nectar or whether or not it's bird seed. Bears love it. Okay, garbage and bird seed. Those are 1 and 2, no doubt, the biggest attractants. Well, what else out there can attract bears? Well, lots of people that live in the country. Well, I shouldn't say lots of people. Some people that live out in the country love to run these apiaries. So an apiary is simply the beehive, and because they love having fresh honey. And so you don't see like loads and loads of these things, but because they're such a huge attractant, as a child, you grew up knowing that bears love honey, and not just from Winnie the Pooh. In actuality, black bears and all other bears love the sweet taste of honey, as well as the larvae that's there. And so when a bear comes into an unprotected beehive or apiary, the bad thing is they could do lots of damage. And so people could invest quite a bit of money into raising bees so they can provide honey for not just their family, but potentially sell it as a profit. This could be a real devastating thing when a bear comes in and gets into these beehives. Well, what else do people that tend to live in the country like to have? Well, oftentimes they love to raise livestock, whether or not it's goats or chickens or rabbits or some other kind of animal, some livestock farm animal that they love to raise. Well, guess what? Bears are also meat eaters. And if there is an easy meal, I always say they're opportunistic. So they won't physically go out and say, hey, I'm in the mood for an elk today, and go hunt down an elk. But if there's an animal, especially a smaller animal that's confined, that cannot run away, it makes for an easy meal for a bear. And so chicken coops can be like a prime target for bears that are coming into the area that's looking for that extra source of food. And so obviously there's ways to protect your livestock, whether, like I said, whether or not it's chickens or rabbits or goats or anything like that. You can put up electric fencing, because if you don't, bears will stop at very little to get that very nutritious bite of food. And so they will tear into things, but they're extremely strong and they can do quite a bit of damage if they want to. All right, what are other things that you got to be mindful of living in this bear country? Well, how about outdoor grills? We all love cooking on the barbecue, whether or not we're roasting up hot dogs and hamburgers or steaks or chicken. The thing is, those grills are very, very enticing. Now, that is not a bear in the picture. I believe that is the back end of a porcupine. But the grill becomes a huge attractant. Now, I will tell you, some people will say, oh, well, I keep my grill really, really clean. I always scrape it when I'm all done, and I don't leave any food out there. Well, I'm sorry, folks, but the grill itself, because of the nature of how the grill works, there is going to be grease and remnants that is still going to be existing on the inside of that grill. And it is going to smell extremely enticing to a bear. And so the fact that you have the grill, even though you cleaned off everything on the grate, does not mean that it's bear proof or is not going to draw bears, because they still smell those greases and those aromas from when you use that grill. And so trying to secure those grills in an area that a bear cannot get to is paramount. Well, what about, say we're not just talking about someone's home, but if we're living in a human developed area, oftentimes there's restaurants. And restaurants very frequently have these things. These are called grease traps. And so they take all the used oil, used grease, whatever scraps they have, and they dump them in these grease traps. Can you imagine what a buffet that feels like or sounds like or smells like for a bear? Just to wander in and have this giant vat of the most nutritious, and when I say nutritious, it's the most fattening type of food there is. They can just gorge themselves on some of those, so in some of those grease traps, and it's not a pretty sight, but they love getting into those things because it's just so rich in calories, and it's bad for humans, but it's great for bears. So besides the restaurant type of grease traps, lots of people will, or more and more people are getting into composting, because it's a great way to return some nutrients back into the earth. When you have scraps from your fruits and vegetables, or eggshells or different things, you all know how a compost pile works, and it will generate some very rich, nutrient-rich fertilizer for your gardens. The thing is, it contains lots of food scraps in there. And so this becomes very attractive to bears. And so they will come into the compost pile. And once again, a bear is extremely strong, extremely intelligent, and they will figure out how to get in there, and they can cause quite a bit of damage in this human country. So besides compost pile, another attractant, fruit trees. We love to have some kind of ornamental or fruit tree in our yard, whether or not it's pears or apples or cherries or you name it. If you like to eat that fruit, guess what? Bears like to eat it more than you do. So they will undoubtedly, especially when you have a good banner year with your fruit and it's ripening and you cannot clean that fruit off that tree fast enough, that fruit tree is going to become a tremendous attractant for that bear. And the bad thing when it comes to this, and this is kind of what leads to a lot of, and again, I don't like the word, but a lot of that conflict. Lots of people will invest quite a bit of money into fruit trees or developing an orchard because they want to reap the benefits. And a bear comes in, and the bear doesn't care what that tree looks like. The bear simply wants the fruit off that tree, and they can wreak havoc. Because oftentimes what a bear does, especially if it's a larger bear, they can get up into the tree, but they can't get out on the furthest limbs where the fruit lies. And so they can't reach the fruit. So what do? They sit kind of in the middle of the tree and they just reach out and they break the branches and bring the branch in and then eat the fruit off the branches. And so you can see the tremendous amount of damage that is caused by bears when they're feeding in your fruit trees. And obviously this upsets many of people, especially if they've invested quite a bit of money in it. And so these are oftentimes the types of complaints where people and bears just can't get along because, again, the bear's not doing anything that a bear doesn't do, but you can imagine the frustration and the heartache if you spent years and years growing these trees for you and your family, and a bear comes in and does this. So, all right, just a couple more attractants. And this one would probably attract me more than any of the bears, but some good old home cooking. Y'all live in if you're living out in the country and you got a grandma or mama that is a good cook, you're going to be putting some aromas, heavenly aromas, up into the air that is just going to become a huge attraction to a bear. And again, it's not so bad that the bear smells these things. It only becomes bad when the bear has access to these things, because he can smell all sorts of things. And so they'll hone in on different things. Y'all know how powerful their nose is. But if they smell something, they go to it and they can't get it. And then a couple days later, they smell it again, they go to it and they can't get it. It will click in their brain, okay, when I smell this, I can't get it. So I'm just going to ignore that and I'm going to go for something else. And so the issue is not making your home or your area odorless, because you can't do that. It's impossible to keep those attractants down. The key here is to make those attractants off the table, that the bear cannot get access to those attractants. Because you put some pies out there, cherry pie, apple pie, blueberry pie, whatever you want, you're going to draw me in there. And it's okay if I come to the door looking for pie, but you definitely don't want a bear coming to the door looking for that quick bite to eat. So just keep in mind, folks, is that anything that smells good for you to eat is absolutely, without a doubt, going to attract bears. And again, the key here is not to become odorless. The key here is to remove the accessibility. Make sure bears cannot get at that, because like I said, bears are really smart, intelligent animals. And if they keep smelling the same thing over and over again, but they cannot get to it, they're going to give up on it. They understand that, hey, every time I smell these pies baking or this apiary over there, but I can't get to it, I'm just going to disregard that. I'm going to go on to something else. So that is absolutely the key there. So anyway, here's where this becomes an issue. If you attract bears, the end result, especially if bears can then get access to those foods or those attractants, the end result is going to be this. You're going to have a bear coming into these residential areas. They smell something good and they get access to it. They can then, whatever they're smelling that smells really good to eat, they can then eat it. And so when a bear starts coming into a residential area where lots and lots of humans live, the problem is when they have access to it, they're going to be rewarded. And when that reward takes place and they get a full belly and they have a great meal, the next time they're out and about and they smell that same aroma again, they know that if I follow my nose to here, there's a food reward and I can fill my belly. And so the problem is the bears become more and more bold. The more they get access to it, the more they crave it, the more they want it, and the more the worse behaviors they begin to take. And so it's not a good sight. I know people love posting pictures of bears getting into these human areas, and I understand the the shock value and wanting to take a picture, but these pictures break my heart because they're going to end up with not only like an unsightly view of tipped over garbage cans due to bears, but this stuff, besides being unsightly, it's going to result in a dead bear because that bear is going to become bolder and bolder, and it's going to start breaking into things. And again, some of these structures that we think are bear proof aren't always bear proof, and they can do a crazy amount of damage whenever they're smelling something and they've gotten to the point where it's like, I'm getting this food or bust. And they're going to cause quite a bit of damage. And so, like I said, if you have a home out there and you have an apiary and a bear does this, this is not good for you. It's not good for the bears, and we've got to prevent that. And you have probably been seeing as many news stories as I have, whether or not it's out west, whether or not it's in the East Coast. Bears now more and more so are breaking into vehicles because people are leaving food in their vehicles. And I will tell you, I can't really fault people too much, because how many of us have gone to a fast food, and whether or not you have the food bag from Wendy's or wherever you went, or say you went to Starbucks and you have a coffee cup, you have these attractants within your vehicle. A bear will not break into a vehicle unless he gets easy access to it first. And the more easy access, the more they learn to break into vehicles. And then when it becomes harder access, the bear knows that there's a reward if I get inside. And I tell you what, folks, if a bear gets inside a vehicle, the damage they could do is unbelievable, especially when they get locked in, and they can absolutely tear a vehicle apart. Now, yeah, Trish, you don't want to see my Jeep. I probably have like a whole carton full of French fries somewhere down below my seats. I will tell you, has anyone seen did anyone see that sad story about a month ago regarding the bear that broke into the vehicle in East Tennessee? Unfortunately, okay, Patricia's, if you haven't heard about it, what had happened, and y'all know about people leaving their pets in a locked vehicle, especially when it's really hot out, and it just infuriates everyone because the people that do that are just terrible people, because the pets oftentimes don't survive. Well, what happened in East Tennessee about a month ago is a bear broke into someone's vehicle, and after it got inside, the door closed. The bear was really adept at opening up the vehicle from the outside, but it did not know how to open it up from the inside. And it tore the vehicle apart. But what was even sadder is it was so hot, they estimated it as like 140 degrees inside the vehicle. The bear ended up dying inside that vehicle. And so, again, it's paramount not to leave too much food inside your vehicle, but I also understand that sometimes you can't help it. And like I said, you can, it's not about being odorless, it's about removing the access. And so if everyone always left their vehicles locked, even if there was food smells coming in there, a bear probably can't get into a vehicle that's locked. But when it gets into a vehicle that's unlocked, and they go in there and they find those fries underneath the seat or whatever it may be, those unlocked vehicles provide access to food for the bears, and they learn that behavior. And then it's no holds barred. They're going to be getting into those vehicles however they can, because they know a food reward is in there. So eliminating the access is the key here. So besides breaking into vehicles, and put it this way, when a bear breaks into a vehicle, it's already almost past the point of no return. What is absolutely without a doubt, I know people won't like to hear this, but what is not sustainable or tolerable behavior is when a bear breaks into a home and does this inside a home, rummaging for food. because this unfortunately is not just bad for the bear, but it is extremely dangerous for the homeowners. If there was a child or anyone that surprised the bear that it has broken into a house, very, very bad things would happen. And so state agencies, that is the line. When a bear starts breaking into homes, unfortunately, that bear is not going to last. And the thing that I don't like is you see more and more people on social media today will see a picture like this and like, oh my gosh, that's so cute. I love it. And again, it kills me to see the bears in these very, very bad predicaments where they're finding themselves in human country doing things that wild bears should not be doing. Because when a bear gets to this point, the end result is the state wildlife agency is going to be called to remove the bear. Now, I will tell you that photo, that bear was just sedated and it was pulled out of that house. But I mentioned it earlier in my talk. I mentioned it many times in the past. When a bear does get used to being in that human country, its lifespan gets cut short. And there's so many other dangers. They get struck by cars, they get chased or killed by pets, they get shot by people, they get poisoned. There's so many different dangers that are brought into that bear's world. Their lifespan is literally cut in half, and nobody wants to see this. So what are some of the solutions for this? Now that I spent a whole bunch of time on the attractants, and like I said, the key point here is you can't eliminate the attractants, but you can eliminate the bear getting access to those attractants. So what do we do to stay safe? Well, the key thing here is, at the very least, know what to do if there's bears in your area. If you live in bear country, there's certain things that you should be mindful of. First and foremost, know if there's bears in your area, because usually for the most part, bears don't hang out. But if a bear comes in an area, word spreads pretty quickly. So be aware if bears have been sighted in the area, especially if it's a mom with cubs, she might hang out there for a little while. And so just be aware of that. But when it comes to solutions for staying safe, remember that attractant, we got to remove it. If it's something that's easy to remove, whether or not it's the garbage or the bird seed or pet food or even your grill, if it's something that you could physically pick up and move, do it. You've got to remove that attractant and make it inaccessible to that bear. Now, what I said before, don't try to bear proof it. People usually fail miserably when they're trying to bear proof things because they're extremely intelligent. And so your best bet is simply take that attractant and store it in a secure location. A locked house, locked garage, locked shed. Make sure that bear does not have access to that attractant. But what if it's something that I mentioned before that's now difficult to remove? Well, there's ways to protect that too. For example, if it's a apiary or chicken coop or your compost pile, you can't just pick those things up and move them all the time. So what can you do? Well, you could put an electric fence, or you could use these things called unwelcome mats. But the electric fence is probably one of the most common things. By just simply putting that electric fence, and you can get help if you don't know how to do it. There's lots of folks that should have the know-how and be willing to help you out. Now, what these unwelcome mats are, I get a little aggravated when people talk about creating these mats with nails sticking up. That's not an unwelcome mat that we would ever recommend to use. What these unwelcome mats are, it's kind of like the electric fence process. It gives the bear a zap if they step on it. And so it's very useful to use if bears are getting into an area where you might store some pet food or livestock feed. And so these unwelcome mats are really cool tools that can be used. You can also try different deterrents or scare tactics. And so a good thing, get a dog. Bears and dogs, if you've got a dog that is in your yard, they will scare a bear away. Make sure you have control of that dog. But definitely use some scare tactics, whether or not it's dogs or lights or horns. I would even use a bear spray. You got to be real careful with bear spray, but you want to teach that bear a lesson not to come to up to your house. And so, did you know, now I will say a lot of this was designed for Durango, but some of the biggest issues that we see in bear country, obviously I mentioned it, it's that unsecured trash, probably the number one issue. Probably that second number one issue, probably that second issue is bird feeders, because so many people use bird feeders, and especially when they hang them close to the house, all you're doing is training bears to approach homes, which is never good. And as a result, you can imagine, you see it every day on the news or on social media. There's the fact that homes and structures and vehicles are being broken into more and more by bears. And so the thing that really stinks, and I wish we could figure out a better way to address this, is there's many cities out there that don't even have laws making it illegal to feed bears or to properly store their garbage. And so again, I see people all the time say, well, why don't we just start finding those people? You can't start finding those people unless there's laws on the books that they're breaking. So when it comes to trash, if you're living in bear country, remember, bear resistant cans don't work unless you use them right. So the first thing to do is get a bear resistant can, and make sure you learn how to use it. Now, if you do have a bear resistant can or dumpster, make sure they're in working order, because so many times you'll see these restaurants or different places that have the bear resistant cans in place, but they're not using them properly, or they're broken. So that doesn't work. And like I said, if you do not have laws making it harder for bears to get access to that, consider working with your community to get those laws in place, because people for the most part will do the right thing or do the legal thing. And so if there's laws that say you have to do this in bear country, most folks will do it. We always know there will always be lawbreakers, but if that's the case, there will then be a law on the book to go after the lawbreakers. So I feel like it's so elementary, but apparently it's not. When it comes to electric fencing, again, it's an added expense if you have to do it, but it's extremely effective for protecting your property. The good thing is there's lots of communities, Durango being one of them, they'll assist folks with erecting electric fences. And sometimes they even have some subsidies that you can help get those things paid for. So what do you do if you're still having problems with the bears? You're doing everything right, but your neighbors aren't. And that's one of the hardest parts about bear education is we can hit 95% of the people, but the 5% of the people that are still doing it wrong are causing all the issues. And so that is definitely when you can start talking to your elected officials. And what you could try to do is, again, get those community-wide bear ordinances, because they may be necessary. If you're not getting enough people to do the right thing, I hate to force people, but sometimes it's necessary in order to coexist with these animals. We've got to be harder on ourselves and less hard on the bears, because right now sometimes the bears are getting walloped because of our lack of action. So anyway, remember this, folks. Your efforts when it comes to being bear smart or bear wise, whatever term you want to use, your efforts in doing that, it helps them as much as it helps you. It helps keep these guys alive. And so anyway, if you want to know how to peacefully coexist with bears in your backyard, like I said, all you have to do is just ask. And it's key here. You got to identify those attractants. Again, you're not going to eliminate those attractants. You got to make sure they're inaccessible to the bears. You got to know what to do to stay safe, be bear aware, how to prevent those bears from getting into those areas. And I don't even have to tell you, you guys are already extremely knowledgeable about bears to begin with. And so anyway, you just ask and you're gonna you're going to learn how to peacefully coexist with bears in your backyard. So with that, I am going to do my photo credits. Bear Smart Durango gave me a ton of those bear photos, and I love to say they're awesome photos, but when you have pictures of bears and garbage cans and dumpsters, I don't think they're too awesome, but they definitely prove the point and help me get the lesson through to everybody. Just so you know, 2 weeks from today, we have another webinar. This is actually cool, and I've done it once before. But if you haven't done it before, it's going to be a tree identification class. There's nothing more empowering than taking a walk in nature, wherever you are, if you're at your house or you're on vacation somewhere, to take a walk in the woods and see a tree and know what trees you're looking at. Now, this is not going to be a real intensive course. This is going to be basic tree identification. And I think it's, like I said, it's such an empowering feeling to be able to look at all these different trees and at least know what family they're in and come close for the most part. So hope you could join us 2 weeks from today. Y'all know that we have the website and we had a podcast. Hopefully that will start again after my partner's life settles back down with her new house construction. But the best way to follow us, folks, is follow us on Facebook. Tell all your friends and family about us. Please provide comments wherever you can, and I will apologize. I've been kind of off that Facebook page for a while. I'll get back to it. But with that, y'all know that we teach these classes, and you guys are the best students I have, and you rock. Because remember, when it comes to wildlife, your knowledge often means their existence. So with that, by all means, feel free to open up your microphone. We don't want everyone talking at once, but if you have any questions or comments, now's your time to either ask questions or tell me a story or do anything like that. Well, thanks, Trish. I appreciate that. Yeah, I'll still hang around for a little bit. My brother's not here yet, so I do appreciate you thinking of me in that regard. So let me see if there's any other questions. Okay. Patricia wrote, the community of Suki, British Columbia, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, has a fantastic network to alert neighbors when bears are in the area, posting online, plus signs and lawns, volunteers. Yeah, it's great. There's definitely some wonderful, wonderful examples of bear-friendly cities. Now, Durango's one of them. Durango's been cleaning up their act. They're doing a fantastic job. I brag about them all the time, but Canmore, Alberta, Canada is probably the premier place I think of, because they are so wildlife conscious when it comes to not just their bears, but all their wildlife. They have regulations, literally citywide regulations, that will close down the parks at dusk to allow the animals to move through freely without being interrupted or scared by humans. And so you can't be in some of their parks and their greenways because the animals use that as a wildlife corridor. And so they don't let people in there because it interferes with the movement of wildlife. And so there's absolutely some wonderful, wonderful examples of communities that have really put wildlife way up there. Now, I'm not saying every community will or should do that, because humans are animals too. We have our areas, but if you want to live in an area that's wildlife friendly, find those communities and consider moving there instead of one that does not have such laws and regulations. All right. Okay, Lori said, not a question, but this session reminds me of something you said. Animal behavior isn't good or bad, it's just behavior. And yeah, I cannot stress that enough, because it's difficult for me to do these presentations because I talk about conflict and nuisance. And those are human devised terms, because that animal, like you said, Lori, or I've said in the past, they don't know right or wrong. They know how to be an animal. They know how to find food, and they don't know if it's not a source of food that they should be eating or shouldn't be eating. They just know to eat. And so these terms I use, I I hope they don't portray the animals as being bad. Usually, and you all know this, 99.999% of the time, it's the humans being bad that results in these conflicts. And so I'm glad you brought that up, because yes, the wildlife, they just know how to be wildlife, and they don't know any better. So no good or bad in them. Leah, that's a great point. Leah says, I try really hard not to put my trash out until the morning of the pickup, but sometimes I can't. Is there anything I can do to make it less attractive? Probably not. If you do have bears in your area, Leah, the best thing you could do in that situation, if you must put that can out ahead of time, is make sure it is a bear resistant can. And I know there's an expense there, but if you don't have that, many municipalities that deal with bears, they make it a law that you cannot put it out the night before, because bears are usually more active at night. And if you're putting out this smorgasbord of food for them the night before, you're just setting them up for a whole night of feeding on these unprotected garbage cans. And so oftentimes they'll do an ordinance where you cannot put the trash out until early in the morning. But if you can't do it, the best thing to do is get a bear resistant trash can if you can. Well, thank you, Bet. I hope I taught you something. This was one of those talks where it's like, oh gosh, I know who my students are. They know all this stuff. And so maybe it's good to be reinforced, and then at least carry forward the message, because it'll be fresh in your minds. Yeah, Leah, that's a problem. I just so you know, I had those exact same trash cans that are provided by the city. Typically what happens, and I hate that it's more of a reactive approach, but typically what will happen is the more the bear population grows and the more issues that bears have with unsecured trash, that is when the city usually starts to take action. And so unfortunately, that's going to happen. That's the nature of the progression of this. But if you can do the right thing, it's always great to be a leader in your community to say, hey, this is the way to do it, guys. And hopefully people will follow. But I totally get where you're saying, Leah. It's in most cities, it's not even thought about at this point. All right. Well, believe it or not, folks, it is right at the hour. I think this is the first time I ever did it right within an hour, and I appreciate you allowing me to go a little bit faster so I could spend some time with my brother. And y'all are great. I hope you join me on the tree identification class in a couple of weeks, and tell your friends and family. And if you have friends and family that have never done this before, and you want me to send them an invite just as an introductory one, by all means do that. So you guys are awesome. And with that, whoops, I messed that up. But I'm going to stop my recording and bid you all a great night.